Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we're examining The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, considering the context, themes and literary methods put forward. The incredible and very credible Miss Clark is going to be leading us in this analysis. But before she does, why not like this video? And of course, why not hit subscribe and join our tribe for all things English, literary and grammatical.
So, let's begin by considering the plot of the novel. The Haunting of Hill House focuses on a young woman named Eleanor, who is invited to join a scientist at an allegedly haunted mansion in order to investigate the supernatural presence there. She is one of a group of 4 selected due to their previous supernatural encounters. However, over the course of the novel, Eleanor is singled out by the house. She is attacked psychologically by it, as well as almost being lured to stay there. Eventually, she's forced to leave the house by Dr. Montague. However, in the novel's closing moments, she drives into a tree and kills herself in order to avoid having to leave Hill House. Like all texts, it's really important to consider the context in which it was written. And of course, when examining The Haunting of Hill House, we need to consider Shirley Jackson herself as a writer and her motivations. The novel was written in 1959, and Shirley Jackson got the original inspiration for it from similar groups of paranormal and psychic investigators who were popular in the 1900s. Jackson was interested not just in the supernatural happenings of the house, but in the fact that it was a story of several earnest, I believe misguided, certainly determined people with their differing motivations and background, argues Keith Eggener. It's important to note that Jackson's personal life was rife with these kinds of issues and misguided troubles as well. She was stuck in a controlling marriage with a husband who failed to acknowledge her literary career, and over the course of this period developed agoraphobia. Many of her novels, such as The Sundial and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, deal with themes of entrapment and the haunted house, as well as obviously The Haunting of Hill House, maybe the most blatant example of that motif. Of course, it's important to consider that context can be literary as well as socio-historical. And therefore, when examining The Haunting of Hill House, we need to remember that the haunted house itself is a motif which is key to the Gothic literary genre. In the case of this novel, the haunted house gives a physical space to something which is unreal and is supernatural. Over the course of the novel, we are kept uncertain as to whether or not the supernatural occurrences are due to the many people who have died in Hill House, or the house itself. It's interesting to note that Jackson muses in the opening of the novel some houses are simply born evil, potentially implying the latter. However, Jackson keeps it suitably ambiguous throughout the novel, and this heightens its unsettling nature. That intersection of the haunted house and that unsettling tone is a key element to the Gothic genre and something that's really worth exploring contextually in the novel. If you're thinking about comparisons to The Bloody Chamber, it's interesting to note that this novel affords you lots of strong comparisons in terms of setting, location and place. Ultimately, the haunted house acts as a kind of confined canvas here. It almost acts in the same way as a stage does for a play, allowing the fears of the characters to be exacted in a small confined space, which they can't escape from. So finally, when considering context, it's important to think about the socio-historical setting of the novel. Like all Gothic and horror stories, this novel deals to a certain extent with ideas which challenge the status quo and which challenge the norm, things that might be threatening to that state of being. It's interesting to note that The Haunting of Hill House was written in the 1950s, an era which is synonymous with the rise of the American middle class and that sort of white picket fence fantasy of a family. It was an era of massive economic prosperity after the damages of war and the Great Depression. And across America, we saw this sort of idealised view of home and family being touted. The American dream was very much alive and well, and that meant owning your own property, owning your own land, and having this sort of perfect, prosperous family. For those of you that have read the novel, that might be setting off alarm bells both with Eleanor's own family life and with the Crane family that we're given a sort of condensed history of across the course of the novel. Both examples are a stark departure from that picture of perfectionism. However, on top of that, there are also lots of other historical and contextual events taking place across the late 50s that we need to be aware of. As well as this really kind of idealised view of American life, there were lots of outside threats that people viewed as kind of trying to attack that vision. The rise of communism, the Cold War, and liberalism all challenged this sort of archetypal family structure that people were praising. It's interesting to note that in contrast to that, there's a clear homosexual subtext in the relationship between Eleanor and Theodora. They're drawn to each other very quickly for a number of reasons and develop this almost obsessive possessive relationship across the course of the novel that further acts to subvert and challenge that kind of view of picture perfect family. And so that quite naturally brings us on to the key themes that appear across the course of the novel. Quite naturally, for a text titled The Haunting of Hill House, home and belonging is central to the progression of the characters and to the themes overall across the text. Eleanor's striving for a home and sense of belonging is a crucial theme that appears across the course of the writing. We see this in the repeated refrain, "Journeys end in lovers meeting." This quotation comes from Twelfth Night, the Shakespeare play. And it's really interesting to note here that it's a play largely to do with disguise and transformation. The two key characters, Viola and Sebastian, disguise themselves in various different ways across the course of the play in order to find their own home and make their way back to each other, often blurring the boundaries of gender. There are quite a lot of parallels you can probably pick out from that already. In addition, the house itself links really closely into that theme of home and belonging in a number of ways. Houses quite literally represent a home and belonging, and yet this house is increasingly sinister. There is a lack of homeliness found throughout it, most pointedly in areas like the nursery with its bleak cold spot, and the interiors and design of the house with its cruel gargoyles, the faces looking down on you, and the mounted heads of killed animals. Eleanor interestingly notes, "I've never been wanted anywhere," towards the latter section of the novel. In fact, we can argue the house is the only place that really wants her, that really provides her with a sense of belonging, and that makes it all the more sinister. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with identity as a theme. We can't really begin to examine the idea of belonging without examining the idea of personal identity, belonging within yourself. And Eleanor is a really crucial example of this. She takes on the identity of other people that she meets and is something of a blank slate in her own right. The house she describes when talking to Theodora about her home is comprised of things she's seen on her own journey to Hill House. The cup of stars, the white cat, the lion statues outside, and all of that paints quite a bleak picture to us of a young woman who really doesn't have any sense of identity or belonging in herself. In fact, for Eleanor, there is a profound lack of agency as an individual. And it goes beyond that. As the novel progresses, her behaviour begins to model Theodora's. She becomes almost obsessional in her, deciding that she's going to move back home to Theodora's in a very unprompted way. And in turn, in a certain way, we can argue Eleanor almost embodies the house itself. As the novel progresses, we're told that the house lifted itself around her, that Eleanor has almost become one with the house itself. There's something symbiotic about the two of them. And of course, as if we hadn't quite discussed it enough already, we can also view the house as being a literary feature, a motif in its own right across the course of the novel. In lots of ways, the house acts almost as a mirror or a representation of the worst fears and worries that the characters have. Everything about it is purposefully set out to throw its inhabitants off guard and make them feel uncertain. This is a key feature of Gothic literature and builds on all of those kind of literary contextual features we've discussed already. The disjointed rooms, the strange proportions, the nursery, the rooms within rooms are all done to make us feel uneasy and on edge, to make us feel afraid in our surrounding. And that gives us a really interesting, really useful parallel with the Bloody Chamber once more. Additionally, it's really interesting to note the description of the kitchen within the house. The vast number of doors leading to the outside make it seem quite uncanny and purposefully threatening. This is a really nice microcosmic representation of the house as something that both entraps its characters and which is sinister within its own right. Another key literary feature that's really important for us to address within the novel is the narrative structure as well. We know that we need to look at this text as a whole in order to understand it really comprehensively. And it's important to note that it's written in the third person perspective, but with a kind of omniscient, all-knowing narrator. In fact, the opening of the novels is very much like a play. We have an introduction of each character and their backstory that really sets the scene, almost like a contents page. The house takes on the role of the stage within this context, and its presence becomes the entire world once the characters arrive there. We hear references of other figures, but they're very much dreamlike and outside of this. And on top of that, the novel has an epilogue at the end. It's almost like a chorus in a Shakespeare play, and this gives it a kind of folkloric, mythological quality. It matches really nicely with the structure of a fairy tale because neither are really rooted in realism in their structure, and that allows us to be much freer and much more kind of interpretive with the messages that Jackson wants us to take away from this. And of course, this narrative structure is really important for us to explore because it acts as a kind of canvas for lots of other literary features and contrasts that appear across the course of the novel. I can't begin to explore all of them within the length of this video, but I'm going to point you in the direction of some of the most powerful contrasts and parallels that I think you should be examining when you're reading this again more critically and when you're thinking about those comparisons with The Bloody Chamber. The first is largely tonal and character based, and that is to do with the arrival of Dr. Montague's wife. She arrives in the latter half of the novel and acts as a sort of interjection of comic relief within the plot. With her Ouija board and her kind of busy, bustling energy, she's purposefully supposed to be a really foolish and ridiculous character. And this serves two purposes. It both breaks the tension that we've seen so far and shifts the tone of this kind of building anticipation, but also helps to heighten it. She is ultimately disbelieving of the behaviour of the house, and yet at this point as readers we've seen some really, really sinister actions from it. That leaves us in a kind of crucial, tricky balance here of having an injection of realism from the outside world, but also being very, very fearful and very aware of exactly what the house can do. The other parallel I think is worth exploring in as much detail as possible is that between Eleanor, her sister, and the two daughters of the Crane family. As the novel goes on, we become more and more distrusting in Eleanor as a character, and we begin to realise the serious flaws in her version of events. But despite this, there are clear similarities between her relationship with her sister and the two Crane siblings. One is controlling and coercive, the other is weaker and much often maligned as a figure. We begin to wonder whether or not that's Eleanor's twisting of events to match with a house that she already has some sort of symbiosis and relationship with, or whether that really is the tragic extent of her life so far. Either way, it links interestingly into the way that the house builds itself around Eleanor, and they almost become one being by the end of the novel. And this of course brings us to the closing climactic moments of the novel. The main story ends with Eleanor questioning, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why don't they stop me? As she commits suicide by driving into the tree at the gates of Hill House. This climactic moment is representative of the house at its most evil and sinister. It is quite literally willing to do anything it can do to trap Eleanor there and keep her there. And that repeated refrain that journeys end in lovers' meetings has an even more sinister quality in light of this. In addition, it also forces us to question the reality of events so far in the narration we've seen. Whilst the narration is third person, we're often given these third person events through Eleanor's particular lens. The realisation that she doesn't want to kill herself after having been so certain and so adamant that she's making the right decision mere sentences before forces us to question and really unpick the events we've seen so far and their validity. Is the house targeting and trapping Eleanor in that way? Is it all in her head? By even questioning that, are we falling into the trap that the house wants us to? Ultimately, The Haunting on Hill House is a complex novel that has a lot of different kind of contradictions and fallacies within it. In fact, those fallacies are part of what makes it so interesting and so sinister to study. Ultimately, it's a novel about identity, about self, and about finding agency as an individual. All of these are themes that I would explore and consider when you're beginning to look for comparisons to The Bloody Chamber and think about how you can draw out those parallels more deeply. Thank you. Bye.